everyone, and welcome to Ranch Management Forum 2021. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the presentations, you may type them in the question box or the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of the control panel, and we will answer them tonight once both presentations have concluded. The presentations are scheduled to take just over an hour, leaving time for questions at the end. We will continue to answer questions for as long as our presenters are able to stay online. As participants, if you need to log out early, please feel free to do so. You can always tune into the recording at a later date to catch the questions if you're interested. Internet connectivity in the evening might be a problem for some participants. A link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to all registered participants and will be posted to our website, saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. So if you are having trouble viewing, you will be able to watch again later. Those recordings and links should be available within 24 hours following the live version of the presentation. At the end of tonight's webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey about this session. Your feedback is important for planning future events. And if you choose to include your name and email address, you will be entered to win a $100 credit towards feed testing. I will now turn the webinar over to your facilitator for this session.
Hello, everyone. I would like to officially welcome you to Herd Improvement Week Session 4, Mineral Programs and Extensive Winter Feeding Systems. My name is Catherine Lang, and I am a Livestock and Feed Extension Specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, based out of the Agriculture Knowledge Center in Moose Jaw, and I will be facilitating tonight's webinar. Before we begin this evening's presentations, I would like to congratulate the winners of our Bull EPD Session Door Prize draws. On Monday, participants were asked to fill out the EPD calculator and email it in to be entered into the draw. I am happy to announce that Jenna Johnson and Eric Schick will each receive credits towards feed testing, semen testing, and mineral. A special thank you also goes out to the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association for sponsoring our prizes. I'm very excited to introduce our presenters for this evening. Our first presenter this evening is Kelly Cruz. Kelly is the Nutrition and Technical Sales Manager for ADM in Western Canada. In this role, Kelly is responsible for the introduction of ADM minerals, premixes, and specialty feed additives to the Western Canadian livestock feed market. Kelly joined ADM in 2019, and prior to that, worked in the livestock and feed industry since 1992 as a ruminant nutritionist specializing in dairy and beef nutrition with a focus on production and mineral nutrition. During his career, he has sought to bring new technologies that benefit producers to the livestock industry while ensuring the value is understandable and credible. Kelly believes that the amount of new technology created and in the development within the industry today will create multiple opportunities for producers if we do our job to explain them properly. Pre-COVID, the dark days of winter would find Kelly haunting the Imperial Rink, toiling away at the rec leagues, patiently waiting for his call up to the big league, when Montreal would need a replacement for Carey Price. Nice days in the summer are reserved for epic motorcycle tours throughout the West, comparing pothole size and splatter patterns of multicolored bugs. So go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think there we go.
Yeah, you're coming in loud and clear.
We're good? Alrighty. Thank you very much. So tonight's talk is peering beyond the label, or peering into the bag, trying to see what we can do and what we can talk about with minerals tonight. So the talk tonight basically is, I'm having trouble advancing my, is my screen showing?
No, we don't see your screen yet.
Oh, there it should be coming up now.
Yeah.
Good. All righty. Okay. Now I'm having trouble advancing my, there we go. The outline of today's conversation for the group, we're going to talk about the forms of mineral that are available and what do they mean to you and to the animal. Hopefully by the end of the evening, I'll be able to help you understand the analysis on a tag and the ingredient list and and again, what that means to you and to the animal. We'll delve into tips on choosing between minerals, not guiding in any particular direction, but just hopefully helping you find the best fit. And lastly, with a little bit of time, we'll talk about some feeding regimes and ideas for mineral selection. And I hope this dovetails into our next speaker, who will do a much better job of finishing that off. So mineral comes in a lot of forms, but it starts as a rock. That would be my technical term for the object on the left. My daughter supplied that, who was a metallurgical engineer, and she thought this was a pretty cool sample because it contained copper and zinc and cobalt and a couple other items, and their project was working on how they could extract this. So basically everything that goes into a bag that is inorganic begins in this sort of form. Now, on the right hand side, that's a colored zinc oxide. So the milling and the actual preparation is how we develop the different products that go into a mineral into the bag. A friend of mine sent me this many years ago, and he said, "Oh, this was an example of early free choice mineral consumption." Not sure what to say about this, but I'm sure they'd be getting something out of the mud and the dirt that they seem to be nosing through, but it's truly not a form of mineral that can be used, and hopefully we'll explain that. There's a variety of mineral forms, and they will give a variety of different results to you as a producer and you as cattle. So originally, oxides were commonly used. So as you can see there, copper oxide, it's highly concentrated. It's 79%. It's basically a copper metal ion and bound to an oxygen and oxidized. Very, very stable. Very low solubility, which isn't that great. It's poorly absorbed, and if you need to think of it in any sort of form, pennies. And I realize I've been speaking to crowds that don't even know what a penny is anymore, but copper pipe. So these were used. We were able to grind up the copper oxide, put it in a bag, and you could state that there was copper in there, but unfortunately, there wasn't very much available to the animal. Sulfates came along and were introduced into the feed industry in probably the mid 50s and early 60s. We started using sulfates. They're reactive, good or bad, but the reactivity in a mineral isn't necessarily good because they tend to react with moisture or humidity and tend to start breaking things down or changing things, and that gets into be a bit of a situation when we're dealing with water soluble or fat soluble vitamins A, D, and E in a mix. So we don't like the reactivity there. Highly soluble, which is kind of good and not really, because it goes into solution. And if you think of the rumen of an animal, they're a 45-gallon vat full of water, so this stuff goes into solution. Copper sulfate, low concentration of copper and attached to a sulfate group, is more commonly known as bluestone. And for those of you that have ranched or farmed or treated drinking water, you'll have put a bag of bluestone and drug it back and forth through a dugout. And we're using it to kill off weeds and bacteria and stuff in the water. So it has an antimicrobial property to it, which, while it's soluble and we can get more absorbability into the animal, this kind of provides some problems. I always challenge, and this is actually a good forum, I always challenge producers at a meeting if they're thinking about sulfates, Google copper sulfate. You can use, and the first use of it that comes up will usually be as a wood preservative because it has these antimicrobial properties. I seem to be frozen up right now. Oh, go ahead. moderator?
We can just, I'll just take control back from you, Kelly, and
Sure,
then I'll
go ahead.
turn it back over to you, and that should help.
Okay.
So just try that again.
All right, we'll see how this goes. There we go. So to give you an idea, one of the best visuals that I came up with over the years to explain copper sulfate or bluestone is a cow in a foot bath. This dairy cow has explained the antibacterial property as good as anything. When we have cattle that have foot rot or hairy heel wart, or cattle that are in pretty tough conditions, such as this dairy cow, we'll often run them through a foot bath. And that you can tell by the blue color that that's a copper sulfate solution or bluestone solution in there. And we use it to get into the cracks and the little injuries and that in the hoof and the lower part of the leg to clean out the bacteria. Well, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of effect does this have on the rumen? And we know it's a very solid proof that it solubilizes, because it doesn't go into a mess in the bottom of this. It stays in solution. The effect we're having on bacteria, if we think of a rumen as full of bacteria, is kind of troublesome. There are other forms of minerals that have come along. Part of the idea of having these ranch forums and producer meetings is to hopefully bring new information and better explanations of technology that's out there. And two of the ones that we can talk about are copper hydroxychloride or zinc hydroxy forms. They're 56% copper bonded to a hydroxychloride group, and very stable in the rumen. They do not break down. They don't go into solution in the rumen. Very palatable, highly available to the animal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But the form of a mineral is only as good, or the quality of a mineral is only as good as the absorbability of it. One of the things that hydroxys have going for them is they have no interactions. They're a very, very stable form. They don't react easily. And again, I would challenge you, if you can want to Google on the side copper hydroxychloride as it comes up, you'll find that the only use that it has is as a feed additive. It has no antimicrobial property to it. Chelates, on the other hand, are fairly well known and evolved out of the human nutrition and human medicine industry, where we've chelated compounds to either remove them from the blood. And that technology of a chelation is the SMARTY technology, if you want it. It's you take copper and you wrap a protein or an amino acid or a fraction of a protein around it. Very low concentration. That's part of as you can see, it's only 10% copper, but it's the process is such that we can't put a lot of copper into that process. Doesn't give us a high concentration of copper. It's protected, very highly available, like the hydroxys. And chelates come in a variety of different forms. There's 5 different categorizations of chelates, so not all chelates are created the same. You have single amino acid chelates probably at the top of that chain, right down to polysaccharide type of chelates, which are or proteinate types, which are not single amino acids but groups that are clumped around it and put on. So they have different properties as they go along. It helps to understand how and where minerals flow through an animal, and this graph is a bit of a representation, or this chart is a bit of a representation of what a lot of people think of on the left-hand side, where we have this rumen, this big vat, and you have manganese and zinc and copper and cobalt all floating around in there, and then it comes through and it's absorbed, or it's absorbed through the rumen. In actuality, trace elements and a lot of the macro elements are not absorbed through the rumen whatsoever. We need them to go through the rumen, the reticulum, the oomesum, and then in the abomesum, the fourth stomach, the true stomach, they start to break down in the very low pH environment there, and then are absorbed through the small intestine. So really the right-hand side is what we want. We want to get it. The rumen is kind of like a gauntlet that we put all of this stuff in, and we try and get it down through into the small intestine in a form that will be absorbable by the animal. So the cobalt we leave a little bit in the rumen. The reason for cobalt salt is that we know that cobalt actually feeds the formation of a B vitamin, B1, and which helps grow bacteria, microorganisms in the rumen to help break down forage. Truly, minerals need to be absorbed. We can't. We can put all we want in. If it's not absorbed, you're basically creating expensive manure out the back end of the animal. Low copper supply versus high copper supply. Concentration doesn't mean as much if you don't have all of it in a form that it can be transported across the intestinal wall. And that's basically what those two graphs are showing, is that you can flood the intestinal channel, but if it's bound up in a form that isn't able to be transported across, then we're not going to get any more absorbability than or not as much as we would really want. So we used to simply think of mineral availability as what we have in the feed plus the mineral, and then we're trying to equal what the cow needs. But in this, we have your feed and forage sources, and those vary greatly in both the amount and the availability of mineral that's available to the animal. So forage type, well, I'm going to use extremes to try and to get the points across. So an extreme here would be a green feed versus third cut alfalfa. So the amount of calcium in those is completely different. The amount of trace elements is different, and the digestibility is different. Again, forage maturity plays a great role. I'll use an alfalfa cut on the 20th of June versus a slough hay that's cut once the slough is frozen enough to get out there. We've all done that. That very mature forage is very high in fiber, very complex. Breakdown and digestion doesn't release as much of the natural minerals available that are found in there to the animal. And then environmental conditions, when you have very drought conditions, dry growing conditions, hot growing conditions, you have a tendency to bioaccumulate things like potassium in the plant that are we don't necessarily need a lot of that, and they will sometimes end up antagonizing the absorbability of other products. Same thing with environmental conditions when it's very, very wet. We found this years ago feed testing that molybdenum, which is water soluble, is an element that will all of a sudden start moving through the soil, and the plants will take up more of it during the wet years of 2014, 2015. We saw higher levels of molybdenum, and that will complex with trace elements and make them not available. So then on the other hand, on the mineral, as we've already discussed, you have various forms. Now that you know, you have oxides and sulfates, organic or chelated, and then hydroxy forms. So those are all the things we're trying to do in this equation to hit what the cow needs. We're going to go into a little bit of the technicalities here of the bioavailabilities. And if we use copper sulfate or zinc sulfate as a base 100, so the availability of that product is 100%. For example, the hydroxys of both those two, copper and the zinc form, are approximately 2 times greater than what the copper would be. So, and not all of the copper sulfate is available to the animal. If you had a tag with 1,000 ppm of copper on there, probably 33–34% of that's available. You already know that the hydroxy copper forms are now more available than that comparable tag level would be on there. So you could either have a lower level of that if that was your form, or feel more comfortable knowing that this form would provide more to your animal. I will apologize to all of you that are out there that look at this. This is a horrible slide, but I really wanted to bring it up because I had the very great pleasure of listening to Webush at a conference that I attended down in Texas a few years ago, and following up on the work that these people did. it really struck me is that the most expensive mineral is the one that cattle won't eat. If you're putting mineral out there, I don't care how inexpensive it is. If they're not eating it, we're not getting any benefit of it. So when we start talking about forms, it becomes important to understand that they play a role in the ability of animal to want to eat them. So 2 studies here, one concluding that when given a choice, calves almost exclusively preferred, and that statistic value is quite significant, the hydroxy sources of trace mineral compared to sulfates or organic trace minerals. So while the hydroxys and the organics were quite comparable in their absorbability and some of their really good characteristics, they found that the hydroxys were more sought after. But Wiebusch's work was actually even better because they put it into a salt-based free choice mineral and found that consumption, not just preference, but actual grams of consumption were higher when hydroxys were used compared to sulfate and the organic sources. So always keep in the back of your mind is what is in this bag, but how well are my cattle going to eat it, especially if you're working with a free choice system. Really quickly, just a comparison, and I think it's important to look at a couple of things on this slide. The reactivity in the feed, we know that the sulfates are high, both the organics and the hydroxys are low, and the ability to bypass the rumen or actually get out of that labyrinth of the rumen is very low for sulfates. They dissociate, we know they solubilize, and then they get bound up by other forms, by sulfates and by iron and oxides, and then flow through and aren't available to the animal. Whereas the organic trace mineral and the hydroxys are very able to get through the rumen. More important to a lot of producers, the bottom line. This is the dollars per pound of a mineral if they were made up of sulfates, organics, or hydroxys. Now, I will ensure you that these numbers are still, the relationship is relevant. The values are about 4 years old now, but copper in a sulfate form per pound versus the organic or chelate, you know, that's about a 4 to 5 times more expensive. The hydroxys, on the other hand, are not as expensive per unit, right? So per pound of mineral. So this explains the difference in the price of a bag of mineral. The old adage, if it's too good to be true, you know, it just might be. It also explains when somebody's talking to you about whether this is a chelated product, why the difference in price. Measuring intake is critical to success. Now I'm stealing this out of the ad, the credit card ad, but spending time observing cattle eating mineral is helpful. Measuring how much they eat over a week or a month is more helpful. Intake of a mineral isn't measured the day you throw it out there and they eat a bag because they haven't seen any or they're starved for salt or something like that. You need to look at it over a month. But the last point, knowing how much they should be eating truly is the priceless aspect. It's good to monitor how much they're eating, but how much should they be eating? And often I bring this up because I've had over my career lots of conversations with producers when they would switch a mineral and they'd go, holy, they're just eating the hound out of that. That's too much. And then you calculate it, and especially if they have, you know, 2 weeks to a month's worth of information, you go, you know, you're probably just about what the tag says. The minerals that you've been feeding in the past, probably they weren't eating at the right level. Switching gears here a little bit, we're going to talk about what does the tag tell us. So we've talked about what goes into a mineral, the different forms of products in there. A lot of people look at a tag. Actually, I'll back up. A lot of people never look at a tag. We spend a lot of work, the feed industry does, to prepare a legal tag. It's governed by the Feeds Act. There are strict regulations as to how a feed tag must be laid out and what information can be included in it. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of it just to maybe help explain some of that. So we have a pasture mineral listed here. Feed form is in a mash. We have a registration number, so we know this is registered with CFIA. and the guaranteed analysis. So a lot of people would look through there and, oh, it's got calcium and phosphorus, some trace mineral. I know copper is important. Oh, there's vitamins in there. That's good. No salt in this. And then you have to explain to them a little later on not to add salt or not to add very much. And it actually has sodium in it. So one thing, if you take home tonight, know that sodium value times 2.5 gives you the actual salt level in a bag. So that's about 17% salt in this, with 7% sodium. There's no actual ratios listed on here, and we'll talk about that later on. And I think that's important to notice on here. But it's got salt in it. The next thing is the feeding directions. How much are they supposed to eat of this pasture mineral, and how are you supposed to put it out? Well, it's supposed to be in a mineral feeder for about every 15 to 20 head of cattle. Oftentimes that gets overlooked, and we'll put one mineral feeder out. The right number of cattle per mineral feeder, I've been told, is anywhere from 25 to 250 head. Depends on whether you only have one mineral feeder, right? So the idea is we know to give them adequate access, as cattle like to consume mineral kind of together or graze together or go in groups together. You need to provide them with enough space for it. Expected intake of this is 70 to 100 grams. So we know if that's a 25 kilogram bag, 250 cows at 100 grams per day should eat 1 bag of mineral a day. If they haven't, well, then we know that there's a, maybe we're not presenting it to them enough, or if they hoover through it too quickly, there's another line there that says we should be maybe providing access to salt. 17% salt in this at 100 grams is going to provide 17 grams of salt to a mature cow. In the middle of the summer, they're very hot, they're consuming a lot of water, their respiration rate is high, they're blowing off sodium. We may need to add a little bit of salt to the diet or provide extra salt. So that's why they would have that there. So I encourage every one of you to have a look at the tag. I don't care what product you're using, but just have a look at the tag and maybe see what it tells you now. Remembering that all of these elements on here, copper at 2,600 milligrams per kilogram times 100 grams per head per day, is going to give you the amount that the animal gets per day, right? So it's concentration times consumption gives you the amount. But it hasn't told us what kind, but it will. This is the list of ingredients that's also listed on this product. So this is about as exciting for most people as looking at what's on the back of a soup can, and maybe just as clear. But with what you know now, you can start to kind of take some ideas away from this. So to give you a hand, monocalcium dicalcium phosphate, that's a source of phosphorus and also a source of calcium that comes in there. Calcium carbonate, better known as limestone, another source of calcium. And then sodium chloride, we've talked about that, that's salt. So we know that that's in there, 17% salt. Magnesium oxide, cobalt carbonate, copper sulfate, manganese oxide, zinc oxide, vitamin A, vitamin D. Oh, sodium selenite. So there's our sodium source, selenium, it's a sodium selenite form. We have wheat mill run, mineral oil, and anise powder. So the wheat mill run, that's the carrier, helps bulk up the bag, makes it flow better. Canola oil to try and control any dustiness. There'll be a little bit of that in there. And then the anise powder, that's that licorice smell that you'll find on some feeds. It's to help disguise some of the less palatable objects in there. And that's also what the wheat mill run would be in there, would be to try and attract them. So we have the salt to attract them, wheat mill run, and a little bit of a flavoring. But you can see we've got copper sulfate. So we know while this is a more available form than an oxide, it's maybe not, the highest level. And then we have zinc oxide. So this is a summer pasture mineral. It's maybe not the highest price product out there. This is something that would be, if everything's running along fine, then we could continue to use a product like this. But should we be running into some issues, maybe we would look at something that contained either chelates, organic products, or hydroxychlorides. I get a lot of people coming in over the years talking about, I need it 2-to-1. My neighbor has this wonderful 2-to-1 mineral, and I need that. And they find themselves talking about ratios, and really need to know what this means, because sometimes a producer doesn't realize it. So 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, they all refer to the ratio of calcium to phosphorus in a mineral product. So examples of a 2-to-1 would be a 14-7, a 10-5, a 20-10. So your 2-to-1 and my 2-to-1 and the neighbor's 2-to-1 could be different products. They're all a ratio that's like that, but they're different numbers. And examples of a 1-to-1 would be a 15-5, a 10-10, or a 12-12. As you can see, the 14-7 and the 15-5, they're both getting roughly the same amount of calcium, different phosphorus. The 10-10, same thing. 12-12, they're getting the same amount of phosphorus, but they're getting significantly different amount of calcium. So I challenge you not to look at minerals as strictly ratios. It's not really helpful. Cattle are fed in pounds, bales, grams, ounces, but I've never fed a ratio in my life. It all comes back to a kind of an old conception that because the ash bone of a beef animal resulted in about a 2-to-1 ratio of phosphorus and calcium, that must be what they need to consume it in, and it really isn't true. It really needs to deal more with what else they're consuming and how much they're bringing in of calcium or phosphorus or magnesium and these sorts of things. And I think Brianna will talk more about that coming up. Nutritional knowledge, we've argued this for many years, but cattle will seek out salt, sodium. They'll crave it. It's required for life. They'll find that. But past that, just look at the pictures. They don't look that smart. They're not discussing trigonometry, and nor do they know whether they need, 5 grams of copper a day or 17 grams of zinc. We have to help them out. This is one example of how we've showed you a single tag. Different companies will lay out tags side by side like this. I like it. It's a bit of a comparison. I threw it up just so you could see that they titled the mineral, cow calving, breeder, for grazing, maintenance. These are all, you could feed a cow calving mineral 365 days of the year and not be wrong if it fit into the program and it was financially the right thing to do. Or if everything was running great, you could feed probably a grazing or growth mineral and all year round, and things would be fine too. Again, depending on the rest of the forages and what you're feeding. But this, you can go down. Now you know kind of what you're looking for. You can see the sodium level ranging from 5, so the 12.5% salt, over to 12. So we've got one that's at 30% salt. So that's, pen out on pasture. You don't need to add salt to it. You've got varying levels of copper, manganese, zinc in them, usually running fairly stable. And if fed at the right rate or consumed at the right rate, which is at the right below the title there, they're expected to consume 100 grams per day, 3.5, 4.5 ounces. They will meet their requirements with this. Other companies lay theirs out slightly different. I use this one as an example because at the bottom, this company has put in what forms of mineral are in some of these. So here you see hydroxy minerals are included as a copper and a zinc form. And in the one, they also contain some chelated minerals. So you see the little check marks on that. So you know that there's a combination of those two products in these, and you have an idea. So never be afraid to ask the company representative what's in their mineral. They should know, and they should be able to tell you why it's in there. Briefly, mineral uptake can be affected by several factors, and we must keep that in mind. So we know what we want and why we use it, where it's in a bag and the levels of it. But things like high sulfate water and forages and high sodium water and forages can really affect the intake. Cattle consume roughly 3 to 4 pounds of water for every pound of dry matter that they're going to eat. So water really becomes a large influencer in intake and absorbability of products. So sulfates can reduce the uptake of regular trace minerals and can also interfere with a whole host of things there. So if you're trying to get a decent mineral program into them, oftentimes that's where you have to go up the scale, looking at a chelated or a hydroxy form to combat the sulfates. The sulfates have a tendency to bind, or even if it's too high, will actually reduce the water intake. So molybdenum, as we talked about earlier, and forages can tie up anywhere from 4 to 8 parts of copper for every 1 part of molybdenum. So some companies will test your forages, look at the feed analysis, and it'll say 1 or 2 parts of molybdenum, and you think, well, that's not very high because the copper is at 10 or 15. But that molybdenum that's naturally in the forages is binding up the naturally occurring trace element of copper that's there too. So that's why we have to supplement on top of it. And really, if you're having these kinds of problems, you kind of have to look at what kind of absorbability or what form of mineral are you feeding. Talking about different feeding programs, these cattle could all be claimed to be grazing, and honestly, their needs are probably significantly different because of what they're. We've got banked winter pasture, we've got fall pasture, we've got lush summer stuff, and then we've got some high mountain meadow stuff there that looks like it's been worked off pretty hard. So think about what it is that you're feeding and talk to your nutritionist a little bit about that, because they're going to want to take a sample. And I've used a corn silage sample on here. From a nutritionist standpoint, my old eyes or Brianna's talking later on, these are the things that we look at in there. There's so many moving parts. Trace minerals are part of it. On that tag there, you can see I have calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc that we look at. So we're looking at the portions that are coming out of those forages. But we know that a lot of that is not, the trace elements will not be available to the animal. So that is why the supplementation of a mineral, even in a summer grazing period, is often important to try and improve the performance of our high genetic potential animals that we have. I threw this in really quickly. Grazing corn, do you test it? It's pretty hard to do that, but your nutrition staff will know that there's quite a requirement for calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus because of samples that they've done. Consumption of these products are not like corn silage, so what you're putting into your mix, if you're feeding corn silage, might not work if you're actually grazing the product at the same time. But if you are and you're using a free choice mineral out there, watching intake is absolutely critical. I encourage you to go out and do the cowboy test, get your boot into the muck. No matter what we've seen in a forage test, or this isn't going to tell us much about what it's going through for mineral. You can analyze this for mineral. It's a bit of a laborious procedure, and it takes a lot to get a representative sample. But you can tell the digestive upset of an animal, whether things are going right, whether they're consuming enough water. So it can tell you a lot of things too. So make sure you just check these things out. To wrap things up, I think what we have to do is we have to understand that what is in the bag, what's in a bag of mineral is actually as important or more than what's on the tag or the bill. If it's a $25 and a $60 bag of mineral, there's likely some differences that I think that you can understand now. Salt really is an important driver in intake, but cows need us to help them do the rest. They, for years and years ago, they had things called buffeteria or cafeteria feeders where we'd put out limestone and salt and copper sulfate and let the cows pick, and we just did harm to cows and they never consumed anything. So they'd eat the salt, go away, and never eat anything. So remember that we'll use the salt as a driver on a free choice mineral, or we have to mix it in with something that they'll consume it in the winter, and silage that'll work fine. Monitor your mineral intake. In the summer on pasture, keep track of the bags that are put out and the days that they're fed and the number of head on it. It's not hard math, but it does, it's just kind of helping make sure that you get the best for your money that you're putting out there. Proper feed analysis is the first step to developing any ration and trying to help you meet the mineral and vitamin requirements of your animals. So when we do ask, sometimes producers will balk at doing a feed test, but it really gives us more insight as to what we need to do to balance a ration and make a better recommendation for you. And then after that, follow up, walk through that pen, walk on that pasture, have a look at the cows. As I say, Red Williams, my old instructor used to say, the eye of the master fattens the cattle. So as long as you're watching and looking at them, they'll tell you some stuff too. With that, I am done. I think we're used up all of my time. If you need to follow up later on at some point, you can always get a hold of me at that email address or those numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. We will answer any questions that come up for you after Brianna's presentation. So our second presenter this evening is Brianna Anderson. Brianna grew up on her family's cow-calf operation in the Swan River Valley in Manitoba. She attended the U of S and earned her Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and her Master of Science from the Department of Animal and Poultry Science. Brianna's involvement with her family farm and research project on corn grazing management strategies help her connect with livestock producers. Her favorite part of working in the industry is learning from people around her, whether that is fellow nutritionists, industry mentors, or the clients she works with. When she is not learning or talking about cows, Brianna enjoys getting outside, photographing cattle, and getting together with friends. Go ahead, Brianna.
Thanks,
and
Catherine.
Brianna, we see your presenter view.
Okay, I'll just switch it over. How's that?
That looks great.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to the ministry for having me this evening. Feel free, Catherine, just to shout out if I get going too quickly. We know that I like to zoom through things like this. So good evening, everyone. Like I said, I'm Brianna Anderson, and I work with Beef Smart Consulting. I'm located in Saskatoon. Just to give an opportunity to introduce myself, since I'm not in front of you in a room, I can't see your faces. Like they said, I grew up on a cow-calf operation in Swan River, Manitoba, came to Saskatchewan for school and just never really left. I was fortunate to study corn grazing with Dr. Bart Lardner, and during my trial, there was also a swath grazing trial going on. So you'll see that I like to talk about those two options, since I'm most familiar with them. Since grad school, I've worked kind of on the analysis side of the feedlot industry, looking at data, and then have worked in Saskatchewan for the past 3.5 years in the feed industry again. So just kind of to set the stage, we know that feeding costs account for a very large portion of your total cost of production. And so this data comes from Kathy Larson, and you can see things like yardage, winter feed and mineral costs, pasture costs, all contribute to your feed costs. And so overall, what and how you feed it has a huge impact on your overall expenses of your herd. So often your feed expenses account for 50 to 60% of your overall cost. We know that winter feeding, is going to last close to 200 days per year in Canada. And traditionally that has been done in the dry lot, feeding preserved forages, offering to the cattle either in bunks or in bale feeders. And because we're offering it in this way, we have added expenses by having to handle the manure, as well as maintain facilities and move that feed around multiple times. So today's talk, we're just going to talk a bit about nutritional requirements, how that might change for the cow throughout the year, and then dive into extensive winter grazing, focusing mainly on swath and corn grazing, but lots of the principles around allocation, waste, and cost can be applied to many different types of extensive grazing systems. The first I like to talk about is body condition scoring. I think it's an invaluable tool, costs you nothing. There's great resources out there to know when to do it, how to do it, especially the Beef Research website. Essentially, body condition scoring lets you assess if they're in good condition, poor condition, or over fat. I think it's just as valuable to notify yourself when you have cows that are doing very well, and maybe you don't have to feed them like you've been traditionally feeding them the last few winters because you had a mild fall and they're in very good condition. You don't have to play any catch up. So overall, it's very important to be body condition scoring so that you can use it as a management tool. This table at the bottom just outlines, if you can have a cow calving at a 3 body condition score on a 5-point scale, she's a lot more likely to be cycling within 2 months after calving. which just helps you get her pregnant within 80 days to maintain that 365-day cycle that keeps you more profitable. Talking about nutrition, we always think about energy, protein, minerals and vitamins, and water. And you can look at it like Liebig's law of the minimum, which basically means you can only perform to a minimum, to meeting a certain minimum. And by that, I mean if you're, you can't overcome a copper deficiency just by feeding more energy, right? You have to be balancing all the nutrients to meet their specific needs. And if we're getting technical, energy isn't necessarily a nutrient. Energy is required to do work or to boil water. Energy is extracted from different types of feed, like carbohydrates, fat, and protein even. So factors that affect overall nutrient requirements, age. So if she's a mature cow versus a first calver, this is really going to affect her requirements that first winter. Body weight of the animal, the level of production that you're asking of them. Are you finishing a steer? Are you feeding a high producing dairy cow? Are you asking her to raise a 900-pound bull calf? The body fat stores, we know that thin cows probably need 30 to 40% more than a cow in really good shape in the wintertime. So that comes back to your body condition scoring. Hide and hair thickness can affect your nutrient requirements. This plays into the effect of environment on the animal and cold stress and how that affects both their intake but also their overall energy needs and their activity level. So if we have them confined in a dry lot, they might not need as much intake or energy to perform as well as when we're asking them to go and graze and forage and work hard for the feed in front of them. This is just a graph showing how their requirements change over a year, with month 1 at the bottom being when she calves, going all the way through to when she gets pregnant again and calving again at month 12. So you can see that her crude protein requirements are in blue. Those would be highest right after calving when she's lactating. As her peak lactation goes down and we wean off the calf, her crude protein requirements are quite low, and then they start to increase with the 3rd trimester. The similar trend follows with your energy requirements, your total digestible nutrients, follows a very similar trend. This is important because if you were to take this graph and move it around when your calving season is, that helps you to better assess, what kind of feeds you might need to be growing to meet their needs. If you're calving in January, February versus May and June, this graph is going to fall differently with the weather as well as with the available forage outside. So like I said, energy comes from carbohydrates, fiber, and fat, and it's often required in the largest amount in the diet and can be quite limiting in rations. We know that cattle need to eat to meet energy needs. A mature cow needs to consume anywhere from 1.75 to 2.3% of body weight on a dry matter basis. 3% is definitely the upper limit on a beef cow. And in calves, we might see them go over, that 2.5% of body weight, depending on the digestibility of the feed. We know that the closer to calving she gets, the less intake she might have, just due to the increase in calf size affecting the rumen fill abilities. And forage quality really affects intake. So whether it's higher in NDF, you're asking them to eat a lot of straw versus really digestible corn silage is going to affect how much they can intake. Some general comments on protein. Protein really changes with the age and stage of production. So, if you're putting a calf on feed, a 400-pound calf needs really different protein requirements to a 600 or 700-pound calf. A good rule of thumb is 7, 9, 11 for cows, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind. 7% during dry cow or maintenance, 9% during mid to late gestation, and 11% when she's calving, lactation, and breeding back, just because that usually lines up with her higher lactation curve. You have to use this with caution, though. This does not take into account the digestibility of the feed, her overall intake. This is just a very basic rule of thumb. And I always like to comment that and I definitely would have learned this one from Kelly, that we as humans, we need protein, we need true protein like amino acids to build muscle for metabolic functions. But a cow, realistically, yes, she needs protein at the end of the day, but because of the rumen and the rumen bugs, they need nitrogen, and they need nitrogen to be matched up with carbohydrates to create microbial protein, which is a really excellent protein source for them. So you can, in certain situations, use some non-protein nitrogen to give a boost, a really sometimes affordable alternative, you know, obviously used with caution and in a balanced diet. So just a few comments on feed tests, very similar to what Kelly had said. So this is a barley silage sample. It's a bit on the dry side. I mean, it's got 9.8% protein. It's got wicked starch at 30%. Fermentation data is okay. Overall, decent quality feed. But if you just were to show me this and you said, Brianna, is this a good feed? We're going to ask things like, what animal is this going to? Is this going to a backgrounding calf or a lactating cow? And then we're going to think about how much do I need to feed of this feed? So if it was going to a backgrounding calf, we need to get a little bit more protein from somewhere else. If it's going to a third trimester cow, there's adequate protein, but they might be too much energy. Maybe she's going to gain too much. So, you know, it's good to get a really good quality feed test done, but then also use it to actually balance a ration. So working with people at the ministry or working with consultants to help you balance that, to see if we can stretch a feed, make better use out of the value you have on farm. And maybe we need to look at improving the quality. So both looking at it as what can we add to the ration to improve the overall quality, or what can we do next year to improve the quality of this silage. So this silage, for example, this barley silage, even though it is a 31% starch, which is beautiful, very high energy, because it was cut on the more mature side, it is a bit dry. Fermentation's not great, and we might run into issues with spoilage and molds and mycotoxins. So something to keep in mind for next year when talking with our silage chopper, to maybe get him there a bit earlier, or maybe we need to plant a bit later to fit into his schedule better. And we can't really assess forage based on just one nutrient. Quite often we want to look at crude protein and TDN and be done with it, but there are a lot of other valuable aspects of a feed test, like Kelly talked about, that indicate, you know, what's its storage life going to be, how valuable is this, how much can they intake, and what can they really extract from the feed. So looking back at that energy and protein requirement curve that I showed earlier, talking about corn and swath grazing, if we're thinking energy-wise, corn, you know, if it reaches maturity that you're targeting, it's very often going to meet or exceed energy requirements regardless of her stage of production. Barley swath can also meet or exceed the needs depending on how it was put up, but potentially just slightly lower in energy. When we look at crude protein, it's the opposite. Barley, depending on when you cut it, can very easily meet or exceed her protein needs, whereas corn quite often won't meet her protein needs because it is a crop grown for energy. So just putting that in context, depending on when you plan to feed it, along with when the cow is planning to calve, can really help guide you in deciding which crop to grow. And then just a few more comments on formulating diets, whether it's making sure your extensive grazing is going to work for the class of cattle you have, or formulating for a dry lot ration. Requirements are always going to be expressed on a dry matter basis. Energy and protein are your major nutrients that I like to start out with, and forage is always an essential ingredient. By what I mean by that is she needs a certain amount of rumen fill to keep that rumen functioning. So even if I can meet her needs on 1% of body weight, quite often we need to find some sort of diluting ingredient to fill up the rumen, whether that's straw or a commodity or a byproduct. Concentrate might need to be used to balance the diet if needed, not always necessary. And then this is when I would check the mineral and vitamin adequacy. And like Kelly said, we always talk about looking past the 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 labels, because that doesn't tell you anything about how many grams they're actually going to get until you look at the actual intake of the product. And just further to Kelly's comments, we know that, you know, a cattle can be fed, I guess they're not really fed a ratio, but anywhere from 1-to-1 to 7-to-1 is absolutely fine. He's exactly right. The 2-to-1 mentality always originated from the ash content of the bones in an animal. So I guess what makes a successful feeding system? So I think if anyone else has had the opportunity to take in some of the Ranching Management Forum conversations from last week, I watched the one on polycrops, and they just kept talking about what are your goals? What are your goals to get out of the system? And I think that speaks true to any stage of the management process for your farm. So when we're talking about a feeding system, whether it's dry lot or extensive, I think every farm is going to have their own set of goals. So for some farms, it's wanting to improve the soil health on 1/4 or start out with 50 acres. Is it to improve cow performance? You've been struggling with weaning weights or pregnancy, preg check rates. Maybe you have to increase your cows per acre, or you want to decrease days in the dry lot because you're sick of hauling out manure. Maybe your feed costs have been outrageous the past few years and you want to take a look at that. Or maybe you're losing your hired hand and it's just you and your wife again, and you just need to find a way to do it with less labor. I think this all really depends on your operation, and what is right for your neighbor may not be right for you. At the end of the day, you have to sit down, do the napkin math, and decide what works for your operation. So this data came out of the Western Canadian Cow-Calf Survey in 2015 from Kathy Larson. What she found was that 62% of operations have at least 2 to 3 winter feeding methods. So you can see everything from swath grazing, stockpiled grass, crop residue, bale processor. And in my mind, lots of these options are some form of extensive grazing or getting them out of the dry lot. Today, I'll mostly focus on swath grazing and standing corn, but a lot of the same principles can be applied to things like bale grazing, stockpiled grass, crop residue, because you need to be assessing the quality of the forage out there and allocating it appropriately. And truthfully, any sort of extensive grazing system that gets them out of the dry lot for another 15, 30 days, at the end of the day should help improve your cost of production. So this can be as simple as grazing crop residue from October 15th to November 15th. That might just might help tip the scales for you. So things to consider when picking an extensive grazing program or looking into it. You need to think of the class of cattle that you're feeding and the stage of production. So often we think of a dry cow out there with no calves at side. There has been research done on backgrounding calves in extensive grazing system. You also have to think about your cow herd. Is this naive for them? Have they always been fed corn silage at a bunk? And that's fine. They can be trained to graze in an extensive grazing program. You just might have a bit higher culling rates in the first 2 years, and that's absolutely fine. It's all about what your overall goals are. Another big factor will be residue control. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. Your infrastructure needs, so this will be your fencing, your perimeter fencing, your water. Agronomic practices, we often say leave the farming to the farmers. This might be where you call a neighbor and get some custom work done, or you speak with an agronomist to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck. And then environmental, this is a huge factor. We've seen in the last few months how wicked our winters can be in Saskatchewan and how variable they can be. So not only your growing conditions are going to affect yield, you might have an early frost and you might not get any starch set in your corn cobs. Or you can get a freeze-thaw cycle and your swaths become inaccessible to the cattle. So these are all risks. Every feeding system has risks. You just have to kind of weigh the risks, make sure you have a plan B, C, and D for when things go sideways. So just a few comments on infrastructure. They need access to water, whether you're snow grazing or you can actually provide them an actual water source. Snow grazing is something where they need a bit of time to adapt. You have to account for a bit more energy needs, and you need the proper snow conditions. If you get winds like we've been getting and you get a hard crust over top of it, it's not going to cut it. So you need to have a backup plan where you might have to haul water or move the cattle. Shelter, once again, in these winds that we've been having, they definitely need some sort of windbreak, whether that's natural or portable windbreak fencing. And then fencing, No matter who you talk to, they will say, you got to train the cattle, you have to keep the fence hot, because as soon as they know how to crawl through, it's game over. You'll have 10 cows that go through and cherry pick all the corn cobs off or all the heads off the barley and ruin it for everyone else. So making sure you have a fence that they really respect is very valuable. And taking into account all these infrastructure needs can really help you determine the location and maybe lower some costs there. One comment I would have about the infrastructure piece is the Alberta government did a really extensive video series on extensive grazing. And they have specific videos on infrastructure and dealing with snow and stuff. That is, they have a lot of different ideas because they were interviewing close to a dozen different farmers on all these aspects. So if you have time, that's something I would definitely pick away at on their YouTube channel. And then the one other comment I would make with that is, whether it's swath grazing or bale grazing, plan how you're going to be fencing the project before you go and place the bales or you pull the swather out. It's probably a much nicer conversation to have in June when you're planning out it than in February when you realize you have to walk twice as far and put up twice as long of fences because you aren't happy with how you divvied up the field. So swath grazing annual crops, these are very attractive in Western Canada because these crops are adapted to a wide range of areas. They're fairly low cost to seed. They have very high feed quality and a high yield potential. So common crops we see used in swath grazing is barley, oats, triticale, rye, or millet. And because most people are familiar with growing these either on the grain side or for green feed, it's a very easy transition to incorporate some swath grazing. There's kind of two schools of thought, either delay seeding so that you can cut it at the proper maturity but not have it lay out in the field for 2 months and get weathered, or you can seed it regularly, take the risk of the weathering but potentially get a higher yield because you're capturing some of the longer day length and early season growth. I think that's really something to look up in your specific area, maybe talk to some locals that have done it and see what might work. Definitely need to control weeds and fertilize like you would a grain crop to get your best yields. However, if you're seeding late or you're not sure you're going to get the yields, maybe don't put a full fertilizer rate on because you might run into nitrate issues if you're stressed in the fall through a frost event or if you have a really hot grazing season and it gets drought stressed. The stage of maturity at swathing, or whether it's swath grazing or green feed, typically we like to hit the sweet spot where your protein's still high, your digestibility is still high, and your forage yield is increasing. However, there's been more work done recently to see if you push your maturity to a more hard dough stage, what that does to yield and overall animal performance. And quite often you're finding that you're increasing yield, you're increasing energy, you may increase digestibility of the plant and decrease protein, but overall you're still meeting the needs of the cow. So traditionally, the recommendations would have been to seed oats at late milk and barley and triticale at soft dough, just like you would for silage. But they found if you swath later, you might increase yield without affecting animal performance. So some specific research done at Western Beef, they compared oat, triticale, and barley at the soft dough and hard dough stages. They found that barley in their case was the shortest grazing days and triticale had the longest, with oat being intermediate. And in all conditions, they had an increase in dry matter yield, an increase in starch, an increase in energy, and a decrease in crude protein. But the cows did just fine. These are cows grazing in the mid-gestation. And overall, their costs were quite low, anywhere from $1.30 to $2 per head per day. Just a few comments on swath grazing polycrops because it's becoming more popular. Reasons why people might use polycrops: it improves plant diversity. You might get a boost in soil organic matter. If you're looking for soil health, these are definitely crops that might help you with that. They typically have a fairly high feed quality. with higher protein and better digestibility compared to cereal crops. But even in that front, I would stress definitely feed test. Some of these crops don't weather as nicely as some of the cereal crops. And sometimes the protein far exceeds what the cow actually needs. So the other comments, your herbicide application might be limited and you can run into some anti-nutritional factors. That being said, there is a lot of really good success stories and there is more research coming out about these polycrops. And the other comment with that is just making sure you're picking varieties correct for your area. So corn grazing, it's a high cost crop, potentially posing high risk if it doesn't turn out, because it is $200–300 an acre. However, it is very attractive because of its efficient nitrogen and water utilization and very high potential yield. It's a very high energy crop. You're growing corn for the cob. It's got high potential to have a very high grain content depending on the maturity that you're targeting. It's quite often the varieties grown in Western Canada, we're growing lots for silage, so we're targeting that milk line so that we get enough starch in there. When you're growing it for grazing corn, it's kind of up to you what you want to target. I'd say if you're on the less mature side, they're more likely to clean up the whole plant, but it's definitely a balancing act to make sure you get enough energy out there to warrant the high cost. There's lots of really good agronomic tips out there. Corn is a very poor competitor, so you have to use a lot of herbicide use and make sure that you're working with an agronomist. It's not a very forgiving crop, and by that I mean if you don't plant it right, if the population's not great, your spacing's off, you have lots of competition from weeds, you're not really setting it up for success. So it's really important to get these first steps right and just hope for a few good rains, and it should turn out really well. The other comment I'll make is know your corn heat units for where you're living, as well as how the company that you're buying the seed from rates their corn heat units, because there's no standard way to do it. So definitely ask, when did the corn heat units start and stop accumulating, whether it's silage or grain maturity. A few other comments on corn heat units. When I worked with Dr. Lardner on our trial, we always kind of said, he always kind of said, pick one that's 300 heat units longer than what you have, so you know it's not going to get to full grain maturity, just to kind of cover your rear there. So forage allocation, I'll be talking a bit more specifically about corn, but definitely can be applied to other sources of forage. Essentially, cows are like kids in a candy store. Like Kelly said, they like to go after salt. They also like to go after really high energy things, just like why if you leave the bin open, they'll grain overload. They love the taste of it, doesn't mean they're smart about it. So that's why we recommend 2 to 3 days worth of feed quite often in these systems. Another reason why you might recommend it is just reducing the digestive upset, improving your diet consistency. So what I mean by that is if you offer them 30 days worth of feed and they spend the first 5 days eating the most nutritious part, well, now we have 25 days of straw and they just might not do that well. And reduce waste. So we often find in those settings, when they all go out there, they pick the best parts and then they're stuck with the straw-like component and they just move it around and they don't want to eat it. So some work was done where they, were looking at the frequency of forage allocation, and they found that this may influence both diet variability and rumen fermentation. So we took that concept and applied it on a corn grazing trial where we fed 3 versus 9 day allocations with or without fiber. So what that means is the 3-day allocation would get moved 3 times, while the 9-day allocation just got moved once. So over a 9-day period, they ate the same amount, or they were offered the same amount, just in smaller sections for the 3-day group. And what we did to try to prove the theory that they go out and eat the cobs first, because we hear about that anecdotally, we hear of wrecks, but we have to prove it in science. I would go out and spray paint corn plants ahead of time, and then every day during the trial, go and grab corn plants and separate them and weigh out the different parts of the plant. As you can see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but The cob starts out at 35% of the whole plant weight in this case, and by the first or second day, we're down to 5% of the whole weight out there. So you just know they're going after the cob first, and they're leaving things like the stem, and they're slowly picking away at the husk and the leaf. So over a 3-day period, that might mean she's eating cob for a day or a day and a half, and then the rest is straw. But in a 9-day period, she's eating cobs for 2 or 3 days, and then 6 days has similar feed value to straw. So just some things to think about. And then if we extrapolate that to the risk of acidosis, because we hear of anecdotal stories of major wrecks in these sort of grazing systems, we had rumen pH probes inserted in these cows. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is just looking at the time spent below a pH of 5.8. And so a pH of 5.8 doesn't mean she's going to necessarily drop dead of acidosis. This is the stage of acidosis where the rumen microbes shift a bit and she can't digest fiber as well as she could have above 6. When you get down to 5.5 rumen pH, that's when you start to see a bit more acute rumen acidosis. But 5.8 would be considered kind of a subacute. And we wanted to look at that because if we're reducing her ability to digest fiber, then she's not utilizing the system as well as she could. So as you can see here at the start of a grazing system, she spent more time at a low pH. And then the graph on the right is showing you the area below 5.8, which is taking the extent of the rumen pH below 5.8 times the amount of minutes. So once again, most severe at the start of a grazing period. So talking more specifically about forage allocation, in order to allocate forage, you need to know both how much biomass is out there and how much the cow needs. So to assess how much biomass is out there, I encourage you to always convert it to a dry matter basis. It can get really confusing, or you can get really offside if you're talking on an as-fed basis and all of a sudden you have 50% moisture, so you're just not providing enough feed to the cow. You can guess the yield just by using a well-trained eye. You can weigh corn, you can cut it down in a row, you can weigh swaths, you can weigh your bales if you're bale grazing. There's lots of different ways to assess the yield, and I guess it depends on how accurate you want to get and how fine-tuned you want to get your system to the effort you're going to put in. But essentially what you would do is take your tons on an as-fed basis. So this field had 9 tons and it's 60% dry matter. So 9 times 60% gives me 4.14 tons of dry matter. In a grazing system, we usually have some waste, like in any feeding system. So if I were to say she's going to waste 20% or utilize 80%, that means I have, I forgot to switch over. I changed the dry matter on that. Anyways, 4.32 tons of dry matter available in the end once you account for waste. In this case, if you change your utilization down to 65%, you have even less dry tons available for the cow. And in this case, if your crop's a lot drier, you have more tons available compared to your as-fed. So the basis of this is you take your as-fed tons in the field, times it by your dry matter, and that gives you the total tons available to the cow. And then however you want to account for that waste is up to you. But I think it's prudent that you do account for some sort of waste. Otherwise, you might be short a few days in your grazing system. And then if we're talking about how much of that the cow needs, it's good to talk about, the individual cow basis and then extrapolate that out to your group size. So cow intake, like we talked about before, is really affected by her size, her stage of production, and the quality of forage out there, as well as the activity. So a good rule of thumb is 2 to 2.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis for a mature cow. You have to take into account, this doesn't account for waste, like I said, but also doesn't account for her nutritional needs. So this is where it's still valuable to take a feed test and know if it's going to meet her needs at that 2.5% of body weight intake. So for example, a 1,250 pound cow at 2.5% of body weight needs 31 pounds of dry matter on 200 cows. That gives you 6,200 pounds of dry matter. Whereas a 1,500 pound cow needs 37 pounds of dry matter, or 7,500 pounds. So this is why it's important to know your cow size. that really affects how much product you might go through. Or if you aren't expecting them to eat a full 2.5% of body weight, that also affects the overall dry matter that you need. So a 1,500 pound cow at 2% of body weight only needs 30 pounds of dry matter. So then you can take those two calculations, so both your yield in the field and what the cow needs, and work them together. And there's no reason you have to do them exactly like I did them. I'm not known for my expert math skills or my expert teaching skills. And it doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to have an 8-page Excel spreadsheet. You just need to get a napkin out and figure out your yield and how much the cow needs. So one way you can look at it is how much yield you have per acre over how many tons they need to consume a day to get how many acres you need to offer them for a 3-day allocation or a 6-day allocation, or however you plan to do it. Or you can look at how many pounds there are out there per acre over how many pounds a cow needs in a day to get your grazing days per acre. I really like grazing days because it's something that you can use to compare to research or compare to other years that you've done this. It gives you an idea as how it's overall performing, because you're looking at how many cows you can feed for 1 day on 1 acre. The one caveat of this is it's not taking into account how big the cow is, but other than that, it's a pretty foolproof method. And then this other one is just helping you calculate how many acres you need to seed if you're going to feed that many cows for 60 days. So if we take the same calculations but look at 70% utilization or wasting 10% more, it works out to just slightly more acres needed, about 0.4 more acres, or 30 less cow days per acre, or 8 more acres needed to plant. So the more you do it on your farm, the more you'll become familiar with how much your cow is wasting, or depending on how you're managing it. But at the end of the day, like I said, doesn't need to be fancy, can be table napkin math. And just for reference, when looking at research in Western Canada, oat swath grazing can get anywhere from 110 to 300 days, depending on your yield and how you're managing it and the weather you get. Same with barley, millet, corn grazing. They often say, if you get a decent yield, you can get 200 grazing days per acre pretty easily. So it's definitely worth looking into what kind of yields you can get in your area and just penciling it out to see how many acres you need to plant. So speaking of waste, waste isn't just an extensive grazing thing. I think in a feed yard, whether you're putting silage into a pit or silage into a bale yard, bales into a bale yard, you're expecting 10 to 15% shrink there, as well as another 10 or 15%, depending on how well you're managing your bunks or your bale feeders. And in an extensive grazing system, we might see higher waste just because we're putting it all in one spot. And ways that they figure this out in research is by actually going out there and weighing it. But you can visually see that is quite a bit of waste to deal with. And it's an important factor to consider regardless of your feeding system, because at the end of the day, you have to deal with it. So if it's in a dry lot system and you have waste, you have to haul it out. If it's bale grazing on pasture, you have to let it break down. And if you're using annual cropland, you do have to harrow or incorporate it into the soil before you can seed it again. But at the end of the day, is this waste truly waste, or is this residue waste? A lot of us would argue that it provides valuable nutrients to the soil. So I just wanted to throw this up here. It's a lot of numbers, but in the red box is the values of the residue. And so what it's showing is that the residue, or the leftover feed from my corn grazing trial, is different than the feed I offered her. So it's showing that the stuff she left behind has nowhere near the same feeding qualities as the stuff that we offered her to eat. So what that's saying is she picked the most nutritive parts and left the garbage or the waste behind, and that will get incorporated into the soil. But she took out most of the feed value, so it's not truly waste in my mind. This study was another one done at Western Beef back in 2005, and they looked at rejuvenating old Russian wild ripe pasture. And so what they did is they spread manure, either composted and fresh manure, onto the pasture at the same rate as the cows applied it. So meaning they went out and weighed how much manure was left over after the field feeding processes, which was bale processed and bale grazed. And it just shows the benefit of the effects on yield when you were doing field feeding versus manure application. I mean, looking at the control, we know that any sort of manure application is more beneficial than none, but you just get more out of the manure when it's just left on the field versus having to haul it out. And this doesn't take into account the added cost of needing to move it either. So in bale grazing, why do they see so much benefit compared to some other systems? Well, really, you're bringing in nutrients from an outside source, importing it onto the field, and because the cow's only retaining about 10% of that nitrogen, 90% of that is staying in the field and going into the soil. So just a few comments on mineral and supplementation needs on these systems. Definitely plan your crop for your stage of production cycle that you want to feed it at to limit your need to supplement. So if you want to feed during your last trimester and you're going to go with corn grazing, yes, you're probably going to have to provide protein. But if you would have planned it slightly differently and fed it in the mid trimester, the protein's going to be just fine. Definitely feed test, because we see that all the time with green feeds or swath grazing, your protein can range 5% and your TDN can be all over the map, which will really determine whether or not you need to supplement. And then the other comment was, like Kelly talked about, just assessing your vitamin and mineral needs. Anytime you're feeding a diet high in cereal forages, they're typically low in calcium and high in phosphorus. So regardless of how you offer mineral supplementation, you need to make sure that they eat it. And then, like we mentioned before, definitely there's some issues to watch for depending on the crop that you grow. So nitrates, potassium, sulfur, prussic acid, particular for sorghum, potassium and sulfur in particular for certain polycrops, and molds and mycotoxins, I would say, come into play depending on how the crop weathers. So for example, if you get some bird predation on your corn cobs, you might expose the corn kernels to the environment and you might get some molds and mycotoxins on there. And keep an eye on weathering. So depending on the crop, it might weather not as well as other crops. So that can really affect your nutritional content of the feed. And just to kind of wrap it up at the end, because lots of this research has had economic comparisons done on it, it's worth mentioning. But I always caution it with my cost is my cost, your cost is your cost. Even when looking at research, everyone analyzes their costs slightly differently. So it's really hard to compare across research papers, let alone across farms. So just to give you an idea on how you might want to calculate it yourself. But for our studies, when I was at Western Beef, thanks to Kathy Larson, she helped us facilitate a lot of this economic analysis. So we would look at everything from the crop production costs, the mineral, the salt, the bedding, fencing, and labor, and that was all considered direct costs. And the indirect costs were our yardage, so electricity, insurance, depreciation. And then we would break that down to the field feeding cost, other direct costs, and total yardage costs. And I just wanted to show this. So in my study, it ended up being anywhere from 160 to 190 per head per day, which is very competitive, I think. But the interesting feature with that was that our 9-day allocation actually costs more. And that might be odd because we save money on labor. You didn't have to feed them as often, but because those animals wasted so much more feed, it ended up costing more. And then looking at some other studies where they compared dry lot feeding to specific extensive grazing systems, in almost all cases, dry lot costs more. For example, this Keln et al. One from 2010, straw chaff did cost a bit more than the dry lot, but in that situation, they had to supplement quite a bit on field to make sure that they met their needs. So if you just factor out a 50 cents per head per day saving when you extend the grazing system compared to a dry lot on 200 head for only 30 days, that's a $3,000 savings. So there are lots of ways just to get them out of the dry lot for a little bit longer to try and lower your costs. So in summary, always feed test and always balance for the animal's needs, regardless of how you're feeding them. In an extensive grazing system, make sure you plan for bad weather, poor yield, always have a backup plan, because at some point Mother Nature will throw a wrench in things. And extensive grazing is definitely, it's not a no management system. Quite often it actually requires a bit more management or a bit more forethought, but if you get it figured out, it can mean that you don't start the tractor as often and you can enjoy some time doing other things than bouncing around in the tractor. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for your attention and to the ministry for inviting me out. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. That's my number, my email. Always happy to have discussions with people about all things cows. And even if you didn't agree with some of the things I said, I would love to hear from you. That's how we learn from each other. And I'm definitely no expert in extensive grazing by any means at this stage in my career, and I love to learn from other producers. So with that, Catherine, I'll send it back to you.
Awesome presentation, Brianna. Thank you. So this brings our presentations for the evening to a close, and we're ready to take questions. If you have not already done so, you may type your questions now in the question box or chat box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. We will continue to answer questions for as long as our presenters are willing to stay. As participants, if you need to log out early, please feel free to do so. You can always tune into the recording at a later date to catch the questions if you are interested. So with that, our first few questions are for Kelly. The first question here is a hydroxy-based mineral as good as a chelated non-hydroxy mineral?
Good question. So first and foremost, I'll put it this way. If you have a chelated mineral, or to my knowledge, there's no one on the market that produces a 100% chelated mineral. So, and if you remember back, there was a slide showing the cost. So most companies will put a percentage of their trace elements as a chelate. If they're claiming this is a chelated mineral, they'll put a percentage of it. This sounds like I'm waffling on your answer, but where I'm getting to is that a mineral that would be 100% hydroxy versus a mineral that might be 20% chelated and the rest either oxides or sulfates, I would have to swing the favor towards a hydroxy-based mineral. But if you had one that, let's say, was 50% chelates and 50% sulfates, or 50% chelates and 50% hydroxys, then you've really got quite a product. So kind of summarizing that, the bioavailability, the research would indicate that the bioavailability of a hydroxy versus most of the chelates that are on the market, very, very similar. Hope that answers that.
Thank you. The next question is for Kelly. You talked about copper sulfate. Is it bad to feed it to your animals? We have it available free choice, and the cows and goats love it sometimes. They only really go for it when they want it.
Yeah, straight copper sulfate or bluestone, I wouldn't recommend feeding it straight. For a couple of reasons. One, I don't think it's doing what you might hope it's doing. I don't think you're getting quite the amount of intake on it that and the accumulation of copper that you might think. Again, going back to that, most cattle and most ruminants, they don't have nutritional knowledge, so they don't know whether their blood level or their liver storage level is low on copper. There's no feedback loop mechanism that tells them that. So their curiosity would be the only thing that might make them start to consume it. So I would be cautious with it. Too much copper sulfate can be toxic. It does kill rumen bacteria. So if something should get hungry or ill or for some reason decide to overconsume it, again, they're not that smart sometimes, they could do some damage to the rumen. So I'd be pretty cautious handling it that way.
Another question for you, Kelly. What is the shelf life of a bag of minerals?
That's a perennial question. So the inorganic, remember I started the slides out with a rock? Well, that's the inorganic portion. So calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, all of those trace elements, they're all inorganic. They don't break down, or if they do, it's at a glacial pace. So they're going to last a long, long time. What most people are asking about when they say the shelf life of a bag of mineral, it's relative to the vitamin content, the vitamin A, D, and E. Those the people that supply vitamins to us as a maker of mineral would give us almost 2 years as the stability of that product if it's stored properly, which is cool, dry, out of direct sunlight. So and try and keep, you know, if you've got a bag of straight A, D, and E, try and keep it rolled up and, you know, air and rain and all of that sort of stuff out of excessive heat. So if you compound that into a mineral, most manufacturers are going to say they'll give you a year on the bioavailability or the tag level of the vitamins being within range on that product. After a year, that doesn't mean at day 366 the vitamins just drop right off the table. It's a progression. It goes down and it kind of would taper off quicker. Extremely high salt products and products with a lot of sulfates in it will have a tendency to break down at a quicker rate. So you buy a bag of mineral and you don't feed it to, if you buy a bag of mineral for the spring's and summer season grazing and you don't get to feed it all, if you store it cool, dark spot, which we have in abundance in the winter and the prairies, that product should be, vitamin level should be relatively safe in the spring.
Thank you. The next question here is there a risk feeding a premixed mineral as a free choice mineral?
Yeah, so somebody has read a tag. That's a really good question. The difference, just for the rest of the people, the difference between what's called a mineral and a premix is basically the feeding instructions. A mineral or a free choice mineral, a registered product, is you can put it out, let the cattle eat it. It's designed for free choice intaking. A lot of products you'll see on the market today are labeled premixes. Yet whoever sold it to you, the company rep, the store will say, no, you just put this out free choice. Some premixes are non-registered products. They're not, so they're just kind of working around the labeling law, stating that it's a premix. It's designed for free choice intake. Other premixes, and usually these ones are medicated, they'll have something like monensin sodium in them, are designed for mixing in the winter. Anytime you see anything with a medication in it, something making a legal claim, rumensin, such as an aid in the prevention of coccidiosis, those you don't want a free choice. You want to mix in and feed at a certain rate per head per day to get the effectiveness of the medication. Oftentimes, premixes that are truly designed to be mixed, either into silage or grain, are not very palatable. They may contain no salt or sodium, and they may not have much for carrier other than limestone. So that one tag that had wheat shorts or wheat mill run, there'd be nothing like that. There'd be no DDGs or anything like that in there. So when in doubt, talk to the person who's selling you the product, and they should be able to help guide you on that.
The next question here is for Brianna. Going back to the feed test result you showed of the barley silage, how could you tell that the barley silage didn't ferment?
Good question. It definitely fermented. I just wouldn't say it had the best fermentation that it could. Its pH was around 4.2, which is fine. Would like to see it closer to 4. You can kind of see based on the different acids present. So there's volatile fatty acids there's lactic acid on the test, and there's butyric acid. So if it's a really poor fermentation, we start to see some butyric acid. We want the lactic acid as a percent of total volatile fatty acids to be around 75. So in that case, it wasn't terrible, it just wasn't that great. And sometimes we can get pretty critical as to what we would like to see it at, just to make sure that it's going to keep as well as it can. I mean, if we're feeding it out in the winter time and it's going to be cold, it's not as much of an issue, but if you plan to keep it over the summer, it just might pose a few more issues.
Okay, another one for you, Brianna. If you happen to be overfeeding a lot of protein, can that impact the cow's ability to gain weight?
Yeah, I think Kelly would definitely have more experience on this one than I, and he can pipe in after I give it my best shot. But essentially, if you overfeed protein, it becomes an energy expensive process for them to excrete the nitrogen if you overfeed too much. So then you're just using a bit of the energy that could have went into maintenance or gain towards excreting this nitrogen. And it's just, a bit of an inefficient process. Usually protein's a bit expensive to feed. I'm not sure if it would actually reduce their weight gain or make them start to lose weight. That would likely have be likely more affected by if you have inadequate energy there.
Yeah, I would agree with you absolutely, Brianna. It's just an energetic cost. There was some work done years ago. Paul Greeno at the University of Saskatchewan did some of it. Heifers, beef heifers grazing excessively high or excessively good quality alfalfa, where they found that the higher soluble protein level in the diets had a tendency to reduce their ability to hit estrus. They had a little less success with that. So you don't want to. It'll harm your pocketbook really hard, and there's no sense in overfeeding it.
Great, thank you guys. Another question for Brianna. Any comments on using molasses products to encourage straw intake?
I think molasses products definitely can help with the intake. So really what you're doing is just providing a sweetener to get them to eat it. Other ways to encourage straw intake might just be by getting it wet or adding it into a mix with a bit of grain or a bit of silage and then getting it really wet and they can't sort through it. I would say with those molasses products, just always going back to your cost per head per day. Is it increasing the cost of the straw enough that it's not providing as much value? But at the end of the day, they can help increase intake, whether or not they actually improve the quality of the feed, not as often in my experience.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Kelly. Thoughts on molasses mineral tubs like Crystallix, OLS, etc. versus bagged minerals?
Boy, Brianna set that up really well because it's knowing your cost, right? So there's no free lunch or no free freight in the world. The molasses tubs themselves are a product that you can use depending on what source of management that you're trying to conduct. Just know full well that there is a price for the convenience of using them. In the examples that Brianna was using regarding corn grazing, oftentimes, and I think Bree Kellen's work there earlier on where they were using chaff and straw, you need to add protein into these diets. So you've developed a product or a program where you are going to use low labor or less labor and you're grazing corn, so you're short of protein. The tubs make a perfect complement to that. You can put them out there, they'll consume protein. Not all tubs are the same. There are low moisture protein tubs. The question mentioned Crystallix. That's an example of a low moisture product. Consumption is a bit more controlled on the low moisture products. The cattle have to lick. They have to provide the moisture to bring the protein and the elements, the minerals and vitamins out of it. Some of the softer tubs, the pressed tubs and the chemically hardened tubs, intake is a bit more variable up and down. They tend to be able to consume more of them. So the tubs are a strategy you can use in terms of management, where you're trying to take a hands-off approach. Back to the free choice mineral, if you had a system where, again, we'll use the corn grazing, you're already supplying round bales of hay out there, something like that. Now all you need is mineral to match that up. If you have a well-designed or a palatable free choice mineral that you're managing properly, it will be less expensive, no doubt about it, because you're not feeding protein plus the mineral, and you're not possibly getting that, the convenience factor, the carrier factor of the dried molasses is not there. Ultimately, as a nutritionist like Brianna or myself, I would always put the mineral right in the feed. So if I'm mixing silage, I want to put a premix in there so that I put exactly 100 grams or 50 grams per head per day, and it's fed at so much so that they get that every day. That's the ultimate goal or the ultimate dream of any nutritionist, but not to take away from free choice programs if they fit in with the rest of the management that you have. I hope I circled around and kind of answered that for you.
Okay, just a reminder that if you have any questions, please type them into the question box. We're down to the final few ones here. Another question for Kelly. If you get a feed test back and it shows that there's minerals in that forage, how available are they, and should they be adjusted when ration formulating?
Excellent question. You can, if you're using a program, a lot of producers use something like Cowbites. You can drive yourself to drink. If you start trying to actually get absolute numbers, and then you start including these ones out of the forages, and then all of a sudden realizing, well, maybe I shouldn't be feeding any mineral. Remember the little part about in there, if you get a feed test back, some companies will test for molybdenum or any of the contaminating or antagonistic factors in there. The level of copper, manganese, zinc, cobalt, iodine, even selenium that is available out of the forages, first is highly variable, and a lot of times, secondly, it's oftentimes non-available whatsoever. So most nutritionists, when they'll sit down, is they'll maybe zero out those values, or if they don't zero them out when they're doing a balancer, they will allow, don't just worry about hitting an absolute, exact number. They'll allow the addition of mineral at the manufacturer's recommended feeding rate or close to it to be included in there, and allow those numbers to go above the levels that might show as required in there. But cutting right to the chase, the amount of trace minerals that are available through some of the forages we get nowadays, that we're feeding, they're pretty low. And going back to feeding silage, a lot of people will feed barley silage, or corn silage, oat silage. Then we start diluting that because of the energy content. We dilute it with a bit of straw. We add a little bit of green feed in there to get the protein up. When we start dealing with that many levels of cereal forages, trace mineral nutrition is pretty lacking in that. So I would use those numbers, but I wouldn't hang my hat that the animal is getting enough. That said, before I don't want to go on too long, but that said, people will say, well, I've not fed anything other than salt blocks for years, and none of my animals are dying, Kelly. So obviously they're getting enough. Yeah, you can say that, but animals, we've improved our genetic production. Carcass weights have almost doubled in my lifetime on animals. So genetics have changed. There's a lot of things. So if you're buying new bulls and new replacement cattle every year, you're trying to maximize that new genetic potential that you have purchased. You have to feed those differently, right? All right, enough on that.
Okay, the last question we have here is, do either of you have any comments on mineral supplementation with poor water quality?
Go ahead, Brianna. I'll follow up.
I think it definitely is going to depend on the water and what issues you're having, whether it's really high in sulfates, really high in salt? Is it a magnesium issue? Those will all play a role in how much they can absorb. So Kelly will probably comment on it as well, but that's when the availability of the source of mineral really affects what they need and what they can get out of the mineral. I guess I would just comment on, in those cases where the water is really atrocious and it's got really high salt content, and just one of the challenges you might run into is free choice mineral intake. So one way to really combat that is just find a way of forcing them to eat it, whether mixing it into a wagon or in with grain or something. And that way, you know, they're getting the recommended level of the product that you choose, and then making sure that the source isn't being tied up by the water quality issues.
Yeah, well said. I agree. And going back to a point I made, you know, water quality is critical because, again, they're consuming 4 pounds of water, 3 to 4 pounds of water for every pound of dry matter they eat. So you can tell in that 45-gallon vat of a rumen what's, you know, what is making up the majority of the volume in there. It's a liquid, right? So yeah, knowing the water quality and knowing the effect that it has is key to understanding it. Getting a mineral that, you know, if you've got a high sulfate mineral, a mineral made, or a high sulfate water, pardon me, feeding a mineral that's made out of oxides or sulfates, probably not going to help you out very much. If you've had really bad water, other factors you have to start looking at: breeding performance, weight gain on calves, calving ease, retained placentas. All of these sorts of things are all little signs telling you that, hey, you know that water is bad. We're not providing enough mineral nutrition in there to kind of counteract that. So yeah, water quality plays a major role in determining an effective mineral feeding program.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in. So at this time, I would really like to thank everyone for joining us for Ranch Management Forum Herd Improvement Week Session 4. And a very special thanks to Kelly and Brianna for presenting tonight. Just a reminder that there is one final webinar in the Herd Improvement Week series, and it will be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. And if you're looking to take in more virtual events this winter, the Saskatchewan Beef Industry Conference runs January 27th and 28th, and the Western Canadian Feedlot Management School will be held over 3 Tuesdays in February, starting February 9th. Please Google Saskatchewan Beef Industry Conference and Western Canadian Feedlot Management School to learn more and register. If anyone has any further questions regarding this topic or other agriculture-related questions or inquiries, please contact your nearest Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional Office or call the Agriculture Knowledge Centre at 1-866-457-2377, or you can also visit our website at saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and have a great evening.